arousing the spirit of awakening for the benefit of all beings, and about compassion. Because I continually pick these really broad topics, I really have to stick to my script because I've already thrown 3 pages that I've written and rewrote. So it's a broad topic, and it's gonna, I don't know, it's gonna go pretty far. But first, some traditions, some Buddhist traditions have a way of offering homage when they begin to give a talk. And so I'd like to pay homage to Avalokiteshvara by recalling my first encounter with the Bodhisattva. So I attended McAllister in the late 60s, early 70s, and most of my classes at McAllister were in what's called the Janet Wallace Fine Arts Building, whatever that. Janet Wallace was the wife of DeWitt Wallace. This is all Reader's Digest money, which is kind of ironic that McAllister, being who they are, was funded by Reader's Digest being who they are. So there were 4 wings in that building: English, art, music, and theater. And I spent most of my time at McAllister in one of those buildings. And in the center of the building, there was, on one side, there was a commuter lounge full of commuters. And on the other side was a conference room, which was hardly ever used. In the middle was an atrium, which was very, very rarely used, maybe for an art opening or a wedding reception. And I attended a wedding reception in there in 1971. And there's plants in there, and there was humidity, which was kind of nice in the wintertime. And there were 2 statues. And these were 2 identical statues, and they were about 5 feet tall and pure white. And I looked at the statues, and it said, Buddhist Goddess of Mercy. And this Buddhist Goddess of Mercy had this really tender smile, like a mother would be holding a sleeping baby. And that smile kind of stuck with me. And I'd begun reading Buddhism about that time. I was reading D.T. Suzuki on No Mind, and I got a hold of Platform Sutra because I'm sure D.T. Suzuki must have mentioned Platform Sutra and non-attachment. And I was making a real mess of trying to implement non-attachment at that time. And I was pretty sure that I had never not come across anything about Buddhists having goddesses or goddesses of mercy. And there were 2 of them, which was confusing to me. But in any case, that was my first encounter with Avalokiteshvara. I'm pretty sure that's who that really was. So getting to Catastrophe, lessons from Catastrophe, when I mentioned that I was thinking about giving a talk about this to a friend of mine, she sent me a link to a book, recent book by Rebecca Solnit called Paradise Built in Hell. And apparently Rebecca Solnit took my idea and just ran with it. She wrote this whole book about paradises being built in hell. So I haven't read the book. I have to be honest about that, but I have a couple of reviews in here which talk about it. So this is one. The most startling thing about disasters, according to award-winning author Rebecca Solnit, is not merely that so many people rise to the occasion, but they do so with joy. And that's an important element to this, that they do so with joy. That joy reveals an ordinarily unmet yearning for community, purposefulness, and meaningful work that disaster often provides. A paradise built in hell is an investigation of the moments of altruism, resourcefulness, and generosity that arise amid disaster's grief and disruption, and considers their implications for everyday life. It points to a new vision of what society could become, one that is less authoritarian and fearful, more collaborative and local. So this is what she, I think, goes through like 4 different disaster scenarios and notices how people come together rise up together, form a greater sense of community, and begin working to help each other. And this is something that just happens. Here's another, this is from the New York Times review. Her new book, A Paradise Built in Hell, is an investigation not of a thought, but of an emotion, the fleeting, purposeful joy that fills human beings in the face of disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, and even terrorist attacks. These are clearly not events to be wished for, Ms. Solnit writes, yet they bring out the best in us and provide common purpose. Everyday concerns and societal strictures vanish. A strange kind of liberation fills the air. People rise to the occasion. Social alienation seems to vanish. So these are important in what I'm trying to get across here with lessons from catastrophe. Everyday concerns and societal strictures vanish. A strange kind of liberation fills the air. This is kind of a sense of bodhicitta. So when I was going to school, I went to school with people from Grand Forks. So I have some examples of people who lived through catastrophes in Grand Forks, the flooding in Grand Forks. And they like to talk about when their high school was let out and they went sandbagging. And they would work on sandbags before the floods came. And the sandbagging is pretty hard work. They're, I think, 40-pound bags. So you fill the bags, you move the bags, you pile the bags. It's like all day, but there seem to, when they tell these stories, there seems to be this joyful aspect to it of this purpose, meaningful purpose, and this kind of idea of, strictures being fallen away. You might end up working beside somebody you don't necessarily like, but it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is how good a worker they are, how reliable they are as a worker, if they're helping you and if you're helping them. And so they would do this before the flood and then a little bit during the beginnings of the flood, but hopefully the sandbags were in place by that time. But then it went to a little bit further to this kind of teenage adolescent heroism where people would run the pumps for their particular house, for their family, and the basements would flood. And the basements needed to flood because if there wasn't sufficient water in the basement, then the pressure from the outside would collapse the basement walls, and you didn't want that. So you wanted a certain amount of water in the basement to hold back the pressure from the outside, but you didn't want so much water in the basement that it rose up to the first floor, because that would be very bad indeed, because everything from the basement had been moved to the first floor. So they would be up all night doing this. And I'm sure it's not going to work if it has to be done night after night, because you're just going to burn out. You can't do this night after night. But normally, the way I understood that, every house would have 2 to 3 pumps, and they would either be electrical, working off a generator, or they would be gas-powered pumps. And again, this sense of purpose and meaningfulness that people got from this, that these are important stories in their life. And I have to say, even joy that they got to do this, to have this kind of adventure. So what's going on here? So evolutionary biologists tell us that we have this thing for self-preservation, self-cherishing, self-aggrandizement, that we care about ourselves, but we also have this other aspect that of cooperation. We've been evolutionarily programmed to cooperate with each other, not just through family units, but in the past, in the great ancestral past, there were tribal units and larger communities. And if you didn't cooperate, you didn't survive. The people who cooperated survived and went on offspring. So when this was explained to me, basically said, you know, if a baby doesn't cooperate with the mother, that baby isn't likely to survive and have offspring. And if the mother doesn't cooperate with the baby, likewise, it's just not going to happen. So there's this sense of cooperation. It's built into us to cooperate. So occasionally, when disaster strikes, cooperation comes out. Cooperation and it's like muscles that are just waiting to be exercised in some way to find this kind of joy of meaningfulness and purposefulness of contributing to a community. Now, there's always this balance between, and this is a talk all of itself. There's always this balance between self-preservation, what you have to do to nurture yourself, and your kind of, I'm going to say the word obligations to your family or obligations to your community. So like Sandy, the woman I was married to for so many years, had, she looked upon these things with her family as opportunities to express her gratitude and her love for them. Whereas me, being the person I am, I saw them as obligations and resented them. So there's this balance between the two, right? So, but this is always happening, and it's something that goes on. So anybody in a Zen community is well aware that there's a balance between self-preservation, self-nurturing, and things that the Zen community needs, because a Zen community, it takes a lot to run a Zen community. So there's a lot of opportunity to look for this balance between things. So I kind of burned out at MZMC working in the kitchen, and I just didn't have it anymore. But there's this opportunity. So there's this, and sometimes we want to simplify. It'd be nice if it was simple, but it's not simple. It's very complex. It's a very complex, dynamic, continuous balancing. But occasionally we want to make something simple. So sometimes we just throw ourselves into something thinking, well, this is simple. I'll just do this. Well, then you make a mess of it and you end up burning out. Or sometimes you just say, I'll get so busy that I won't look into it. I won't look into the nurturing part. And it's you make a mess of it. So whoever thought that someone like Joan Halifax, who works with healthcare providers, wrote a book called Standing on the Edge, which talks about this very topic. Again, a whole book written about finding this balance between self-nurturing, finding the boundaries between self-nurturing, taking care of yourself, and wanting to take care of others, wanting to take care of others. So you learn these terms like pathological altruism. Whoever thought I would come and hear a phrase like pathological altruism? But it happens, and people have to be aware of this kind of thing. So there's always this balance. So this balance we see in history as well. In early Buddhism, the goal was pretty clearly escaping, getting out of here. This world is troublesome, and it'd be best just to leave. So desire was the big problem, and escaping the world of sorrow was the goal. All through the early literature, there are these mentions in the assemblies of arhats, those who will not be returning, those who will not have a rebirth. And then there's the once returners, and then there's stream enterers. And it's obviously that there's this hierarchy, and the arhats are on top of the hierarchy. At the Buddha's deathbed, everybody is sobbing and crying, and in the corner, there are these arhats who are just standing there. And it's like, man, I don't know, but I don't think I would want to be an arhat. I think I would rather be one of the people sobbing. But obviously, it was something in the early Buddhism that there was this hierarchy and not wanting to return. 500 years or so later, there was a significant reorientation. 500 years of meditation, 500 years of working in community with each other, and something vast shifted. Suddenly, it's not escape, it's transformation. We're not going to escape samsara. We're going to transform samsara into nirvana. The bodhisattva ideal of saving all beings replaces this ideal of being an arhat. This is really significant, and it's this idea of bodhicitta arousing the spirit of awakening for the benefit of all beings. It's significant wording because a lot of people are interested in arousing the spirit of awakening, but it's not just arousing the spirit of awakening. It's arousing the spirit of awakening for the benefit of all beings. If it's not for the benefit of all beings, it's really not arousing the spirit of awakening. In Tibetan world, well, I'll talk about that later. So one way to look at this progression, I think, that helped me keep this structure down is moving from the arhat ideal to the bodhisattva ideal. I'd like to suggest a similar progression with the three marks of existence, which are the truth of suffering, the truth of impermanence, and the truth of no fixed independent self, no self. Most people come to a Zen center somewhat aware of the truth of suffering. Something is off, something is not quite right. And the thinking that maybe meditation would help, especially with all the culture into mindfulness these days. I've never heard of anyone coming to a Zen center and say, I'm here to save all beings. Did I come to the right place? I've never heard of that. Saving all beings is generally not one of the motivations for coming to a Zen center. Yet within a few hours or days or weeks, one will hear or participate in a vow to save all beings. And it's like, I remember hearing that, and it's like, what is with that? And what I was just going to say earlier was with Tibetans, Tibetans allow for levels, whereas in Zen, everything is all at once, bang, everything is there. But in Tibetan, there's levels, and there's even levels for this idea of saving all beings, arousing the spirit of awakening to save all beings. So they say you can have an aspiration to arouse the spirit of awakening, or you can actually arouse the spirit of awakening. And then there's another level where you actually do something about it. But they allow this kind of preliminary level of arousing. Let me aspire. Let me please learn to aspire to arouse the spirit of awakening so that we can move up. So with the early teachings that one encounters in a Zen center, one starts to get some curiosity, one starts to get some meditation under one's belt, and one starts to see the likely truth of impermanence, because there's a lot of reasons to see the truth of impermanence. It makes sense in terms of catastrophe. There's minor catastrophes like job issues, relationship issues, and these are all, really good kind of laboratories for looking at the truth of impermanence, of holding on to things that can't be held on to and rejecting things that can't be rejected. And it's just the truth of impermanence and the truth of suffering. So this all goes on in the midst of continuous change, and it's hard. And you begin to have this kind of tool set to look at this, tool set to look at how things are impermanent, how things cause you to suffer. It starts to make sense and provides a frame to investigate what's going on. So, but it's the truth of no fixed independent self that trips most people up, and including me. It's tripped me up for some time, because after all, who is all this happening to? It's happening to me. So there's this it's much more subtle teaching, but it's tied to the same thing because it is all the same thing: the truth of suffering, the truth of impermanence, the truth of no self. It's just that impermanence reaches deeper and deeper with certain experiences. And my own sense is that it takes more of a major catastrophe or series of catastrophes to shock the system in a way to realize, to reveal the truth of no self, because the impermanence just penetrates. It's embedded right within impermanence and the suffering that it entails, but it requires a much fuller, deeper experience of impermanence to realize that impermanence is very fundamental even to our sense of the self. So as Joan Halifax said in this last practice period, she said it a number of times, a good existential crisis can be useful. Which brings me to my personal situation. In my case, and I can't avoid the personal aspect to all this, I'm just going to go through this quickly because I don't want to get emotional. But Katagiri Roshi died in 1990. My mother died in 1998, 8 years bedridden after a brain aneurysm and series of strokes. My dad died in 2004 after 8 years of Alzheimer's, the last 4 years in memory facility. My wife, Sandy, of 38 years, died in 2016 after about 2 years after being diagnosed with kidney cancer. But the last 6 months were particularly trying. From December till May, she spent only 4 nights at home. Otherwise, she was in the hospital and rehab until she came home for hospice, which was only 3 or 4 days. Then my younger brother died in 2018 after 12 or 13 years of early onset Alzheimer's. And the last 12 years of his life, the only word he spoke was no, which kind of relates to the whole moo thing, but I won't go there. So that's quite a barrage of shocks to the system. So one thing I learned was pretty much everything I had invested in mentally, psychologically, to provide protection, to shield me, or at least filter me from life's harsher realities, was an illusion, pretty worthless, kind of a very cruel joke that I had bought into. The one thing that helped me was Zen practice, and particularly Hongzhi saying, facing everything, let go and attain stability. So not turning away, just letting it run through. So I had been sitting long enough that I was pretty good at sitting, and I sat in waiting rooms, emergency rooms, hospital rooms, nursing room lounges. I sat everywhere. So a lot of the times that's all you can do. You're just in a room with another person. So what does that come down to? Everything was simplified, as Rebecca Solnit reviewers mentioned. Things just drop away. Concerns, personal concerns fall away. I think everyone experiences this. I'm not particular in that the people that were influential, and I knew it for a long time in my life, are faded and died. It's just this is what happens. But what happens is a lot of concerns just fall away, and there is this very pointed immediacy. Kikon pointed me to a passage in one of Katagiri's transcripts that I'll paraphrase. Smart or not, stupid or not, strong or not, ready or not, it doesn't matter. There you are. And this is getting into the whole thing that Katagiri brought up many times, of getting to a point where you can't move. There's just no place to move. So the point of this immediacy is that this is not the self that you were working on to improve with this kind of aspirational buffer. Someday I'll be this better person. but that forward projecting improved version of yourself is cut off. You're just who you are at that time. You're just who you are. What are you going to do? So there's all these, and especially when you're dealing with people with just put it bluntly, brain damage or Alzheimer's, particulars have fallen away. Those people may not, people that were very, very close to you, may not even know who you are. Their particulars of their life have fallen away. And you're pretty much in the same situation, in a reflected situation. The particulars of you, your narrative, your story, doesn't matter. It's just you in that room. So what brings you into that room? These are some things I found. I found there is no refuge in thinking. There's not a lot of refuge in all this construction of self. If you're in a bad situation, all you're going to do is make judgments over and over and over again that you're in a bad situation. It's really a blessing to learn to shut up under those circumstances and just let it roll. Just be in the bad situation. Don't tell yourself you're in a bad situation, because you're just entangling yourself more. You can't debate your way out of grief. There's no way. And I found a sense of untethering. This is really getting kind of the heart of this idea of no self. Sally Tisdale talks about grief as reaching out for something that isn't there. You know it isn't there, but you keep reaching out for it anyway. And that's one of the best analogies or metaphors, whatever that is, that I've come across. So for the influential people in my life, we can say they formed who I am, but it's maybe more accurate to say I formed who I am through their inspiration, their influence, their being part of my life. And then I'm still reaching for them in a way, and I'm finding out that the substance of them, one substance of them is gone, but a lot of the substance of them is still here. My memories are still here. The influences they had, my strategies, all the stuff that I carry around with me is still here. It's just that I'm untethered from this person who created that. So I'll give you a simple example. Sandy loved her trees, and she hated when people trim trees. She especially hated out at her parents' lake cottage when her dad would trim trees just to improve the view. She thought that was sacrilege. Her idea, which I guess she got from her grandmother, was trees know what they're doing. We shouldn't be interfering with the way trees grow. But when trees around my house start, brushing up against shingles, I would trim the trees, and she would be mad at me, like seething mad for like a week. It took her a while to get over that. But now she's gone. I don't have to put up with someone seething mad at me for a week. But still, when I go to trim a tree, all that still comes up for me. But it's untethered. And all of this is untethered. So the solidity that my thoughts were bouncing against is going away. And you're in a room with people who are declining and dying. And it's like you're reflecting that in a different way. It's like a tide is coming in. And death is coming in, and it's gonna show up. But it's reflected in you in a different way. And there's this kind of untethering. So there's an insight in there to no fixed independent self, but I can't go much further in that explanation. There are choices now that come up, when I want to trim a tree, whatever. So I can continue with patterns that were useful, And I can also continue with patterns that weren't so useful. I'm not as fixed. I'm not quite as tied to things. So I would say basically what happens is the major catastrophe kind of opens you up. The people who have these major catastrophes like sandbagging in Grand Forks, they know it's temporary. So they can live with this. There's kind of a joy and I don't know, exuberance and kind of liberation for this moment. So we're going to do this for now, but we're not going to keep this up. I'm going to still not like my neighbor once this is all over. But with somebody dying, especially dying in a very, very slow and painful way, it's something you have to really work on in a different way. And it opens you up, and it opens you up, and it kind of tears you up as it opens you up. But there is a kind of liberation there. So what I'm going to say is, years of sitting comes down to just something very simple and direct, which is nice because all this balance between self-nurturing, self-preservation, and cooperation with the community is not easy and complex. But this comes down to something very simple and direct. Are you open and opening, or are you constricted and constricting? That's basically what it comes down to. Are you open and opening, or are you constricted and constricting? So that's my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jen. I'll let you choose anybody who raises their hand for a comment. I'll leave that up to you. So if you
there's lots of things that we can talk about because this is such a broad topic. So one thing I would suggest is Kikan has done a transcript of Katagiri talk on save all beings. And I would suggest heartily one of these days, Kikan or I are going to be brave enough to talk about this talk. But I would suggest people go and look at this at katagiritranscripts.net, because it's not, of course, just like everything else, it's not what we think it is. And what it is really important. And then, of course, we can look at how the pandemic is a kind of catastrophe and how things have changed because of that. Kyoko, you haven't, there you go.
Yeah. I'm speechless. I'm constricting. And in a way, that's exactly true. I really appreciate your talk. You have such a way of really bringing things right to the heart. A small thing I'd like to ask you is to say the Hangzhou quote again. It started out, facing everything.
Well, I can read the larger part because it's really quite an exceptional piece. So this is, I don't know, it's face everything, let go, and attain stability. Vast and far-reaching, without boundary, secluded and pure, manifesting light, this spirit is without obstruction. Its brightness does not shine out, but can be called empty and inherently radiant. Some people would say, but can be called boundless and inherently radiant. Its brightness, inherently purifying, transcends causal conditions beyond subject and object. Subtle but preserved, illumined and vast, also it can be spoken of as being or non-being, or discussed with images or calculations. Right in here, the central pivot turns, the gateway opens, You accord and respond without laboring and accomplish without hindrance. Everywhere, turn around freely, not following conditions, not falling into classifications, facing everything, let go and attain stability. Stay with that, just as that. Stay with this, just as this. That and this are mixed together with no discriminations as to their places. So it is said that the earth lifts up the mountains without knowing the mountain's stark steepness. A rock contains jade without knowing the jade's flawlessness. That's pretty potent stuff.
Yeah, particularly when you're living it. Your talk really tied in with something that came up for me this morning in meditation. In the last day or two, I've been doing some work that I've never done before, contacting my legislators. And before I started writing and phoning and things like that, the thought came to me, this is unacceptable. And then, this is unavoidable. This is the nature of human beings. So it fits right in with what you're saying. And so I'm just curious, I guess for myself, I said, everything's included. Everything's included. And yet I still am searching for something that's not this. The thought comes up, I'm writing to the conference committee where they're considering police reform, which the House of the Minnesota legislature is very enthused about. And the Senate side of the conference committee, which is where when they come together to say, what are we going to take to the governor? They've left out police reform, period. So I think really this isn't so much a question as just an appreciation, Ryushin, because I think just even in just this talk, but in your life, you really show us that no, it's not easy to be with, this is unacceptable, this is unavoidable. And yet it's worth doing and it can be done. And it enriches our lives. And because we're all connected, everybody else's lives. So I think this is just an elaborate thank you and connection with what you had to say.
I want to say that I didn't come to Zen practice to become an emotionally sensitive person. I came hoping for bliss. I wanted the bliss end of things, not the hurting side of things. And so when the hurting side of things kept coming up and I was getting softer and tenderized, I was very suspicious and I didn't like what was happening. So my Zen practice has a lot of gaps in it. If I showed up with a resume like this for a job, people would ask, what are these gaps in your work history? And one of the biggest gaps was because I didn't like what was going on. I didn't like becoming softer and more tender. I didn't trust the process. And fortunately, you can walk away from Zen practice, but Zen practice doesn't necessarily walk away from you. And these deaths kept bringing me back because that's the only place I knew to go. And the things that got me through these things were having friends who were willing to talk about things at this depth and meditation. So.
Anyone else have a comment? All right, well, thank you, Ryushin. And let's see here. There we are.
Couple of
Back.
questions, Carl.
Excuse me, go
There
ahead.
were a couple of questions. Kikan had a question.
Oh, I didn't. Maybe Jan didn't see who was raising their hands. Go ahead. We can go back to questions. Kikan, you had a question?
Sure. I don't know if this is a question or what, but going back to, oh, wait a second. Now I've completely lost track of what I was going to say. Oh, yeah. You brought up the pandemic. And it seems to me like there's some difficulty there with the concept of kind of people gathering together and banding together to do good and taking joy in that, because it maybe seemed like that was going on for a while or might happen for a while, but now it seems like what we're encountering is mostly difficulty, or a lot of difficulty anyway. People don't, sometimes, yeah, people are coming together and that's great, but there's a lot of the other side of that too. A lot of difficulty between people. And I think that from my point of view, this kind of tribalism thing comes up. People kind of just broaden their view, but it's just within their particular groups. So I guess my question, if there is one, is how can we be more, how can we broaden our groups? Should we broaden our groups to where we're doing more good for a larger number of people, for the world? I don't know, it's just a opening to talk about the pandemic, basically, if you want to.
So the pandemic is kind of unique in that these other crises, like Rebecca Solnit was talking about, are kind of short-lived, and it's very kind of clean to come together and work with each other. In the pandemic, you can't even work with each other. You can't even get within 6 feet of each other. So that's an issue right there. And then a lot of Joan Halifax, John Donne, these people talk about expanding your in-group. And this is kind of the way that most of the guided meditation for loving kindness works. But I'll tell you a little story. When my mom was in one of the first nursing homes, you'd walk into the nursing home and there'd be these cluster of old women with white hair gathered around the nurses' station, because then the nurses can kind of keep their eye on them. And I walked right by my mom, maybe more than once, because I didn't recognize her because she'd changed so much. But it was like I was saying about particulars, it's like any one of those women could have been my mother. I'm saying it's just the particulars. You know, I know who my mom is, but she didn't know who I was at that time. But it's like any one of those women could have been my mother. Any one of those women, I could have gone and sat in their room and just been with them, which is what a lot of this just comes down to. So it's like it's hard to make a distinction at a certain level, if that makes any sense at all.
Who else had a comment? I think was there anybody else, Elizabeth, that had a comment?
I thought Mary's spouse, I'm so sorry, I can't remember your name. But okay, so misunderstood.
Paul.
Yeah,
No,
Paul, I'm so sorry. I guess not.
He's waving us off. All right, then. Well, let's see. I'm host next week also. And Jushin, Stephen Butcher from Maryland, will be giving the talk. And what is his talk? I have it right here. Life is hard. Isn't that what it is? What is it? Freedom is hard. So we will go with that. Let's see, what else do we have here? You know, the rest of the information about our Sunday talks, the schedules, and the upcoming speakers is on the website. Also, I put a little Donna link into the chat box, and the closing chant is in there also, if anybody should need it. So that's all right. I think I got it covered as host this morning. So we will close with the 4 vows. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. And now we'll do 4 bells to ring out the speaker. And there. Thanks so much for being with us this morning. It's a beautiful day here at Hokyoji. In the low 80s, sun is shining, and we're going to go out and do some more work on the countryside. So anyway, see you next week. Same time, same station. Yes.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Carl.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Ryushin.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Have fun working.